Hello, team. It has been a minute. I apologize for my absence. Grad school unfortunately got the best of me for the past week, but that is all over now. And goddamn, does it feel good to be back. And without further ado, let's jump into it. I've been thinking about how to do this video for a while now because you have this duality that comes with early access, which on one hand, well, there are fair criticisms, there are things that we should bitch about and problems we should acknowledge. But on the other hand, well, we can kind of hand wave a lot of it because it is early access and we're just going to innately encounter those things. And that's kind of what we signed up for. Personally, I reject the idea that either of these things are inherently negative. Starting with criticism, I think criticism is a good thing. I think that's one of the most valuable things human beings can communicate between one another. It's a major stimulus for growth, and it's especially helpful when your ability to self-improve starts reaching its limitations. And don't get me wrong, obviously when people are delivering their criticisms and their critiques, 99% of the time it's completely fucking obnoxious, especially when they're crying about it like, I just don't like this. Shut the fuck up. Holy fuck off. Jesus Christ. But if you're able to get past the emotional layer there and kind of separate out what they're actually talking about, I still think there's value there, even though it is a fully grown man acting like a fucking child. But the other problem is, even if someone says their criticisms in a non-negative, level-headed way, we still look at them like, oh, you soulless bastard, you must fucking hate everything. And I think that this is wrong too. I am someone who loves everything that I do. I thoroughly enjoy everything, probably too much. It's one of my big problems realistically. But I am also someone who critiques literally everything all the time, because I know, as someone who creates things, the most valuable feedback you can get is when someone is willing to shoot it to you straight and articulate it in a level-headed manner, rather than just simply hiding it and not saying anything because they're worried about hurting your feelings or coming across as negative. And again, I don't think criticism or critiques are inherently negative. They're simply a stimulus for growth that require the truth. When I'm critiquing or criticizing things, it's not like this person is my adversary and I'm trying to shit on them. I view it more as though they are my colleague and I am trying to help them. And I think if we conduct ourselves on the latter perspective, it's just far more productive across the board. With all that being said, on the other side of the duality of early access is that there is just going to be problems and shortcomings no matter what, and I don't think that that is a negative thing either. Quite literally, the entire point of the functionality of early access is to release the game in an unfinished state so it can exponentiate the speed at which it releases to the finished state. Welcome to the reality of being alive, where you pretty much never get to have your cake and eat it too. That is a rarity. You can either play the game now and have it released sooner, but also encounter a bunch of problems in shitty design, or we can wait 5 years for the QA team to get it all figured out. That way, you don't have to have a mental fucking breakdown when you see a tower on the map, only to inevitably find something else to fucking cry about because you're predisposed to doing that, regardless of the outcome you would have encountered anyway. With all of that acknowledged, I think two things can be true at the same time. I'm happy to point out all the failures and poor design and issues with the game, while also being okay with the fact that those things exist, because that is simply the price of doing business when it comes to early access. And I'm more than happy to participate in the game in its unfinished state if it means it brings us to the finished state much sooner. With all that being said, my approach for this video was to frame my thoughts in the perspective of changes I would like to see moving forward. This way I could acknowledge the clear and obvious problems of early access that we're having right now without sitting there beating a dead fucking horse and bitching about the fact that it's early access. Anyways, with all that malarkey out of the way, let's talk about towers. One of the big changes I would like to see moving forward in the game is just the removal of towers. I don't think there's a lot of merit to the system. I don't think there's really anything you can do to save it. They are clearly the worst version of sextants we have ever seen, and those got removed in PoE 1 because everyone hated those too. Not only are towers the absolute epitome of do your chores before you play the game, because you have to go around all the fucking dead maps, then get to the towers and do all 4 towers before you can actually run a map worth value and all this other bullshit. They are also a heinous injection of RNG. Not only do you have to find towers in like a specific cluster formation where they encircle a bunch of maps, or they're at the center of a bunch of maps and things like that, they also can't be near a bunch of lakes or water where there are no maps to actually juice upon. And then also that you have to have some sort of connection to them. God forbid if you see a bunch but you don't have any ways to connect to them, it's an hour or two before you can even fucking get to them, before you can even begin your fucking chores. And then on top of that, you have to have good precursor tablets, because God forbid you waste your time by using, maybe not a quant one or something like that. But then on top of getting the precursor tablets, they need to land on good maps, because God forbid they land on something like Val Factory or Val Foundry or Crypt or something like that, where now all the time that you have spent investing and juicing your maps is now wasted because it landed on some dog shit fucking map that is a double waste of time. While I don't think it was a perfect system by any means, I think something like Scarabs from PoE 1 would be far better. Having some measure of determinism of what maps we run or what is on the maps that we're running, and not having to rely on the RNG of towers or the chore that it is to get to the fucking towers, or finding the right, geographic cluster of towers, or them not being next to a fucking lake. I think all of these things could just simply be solved if you could just throw a bunch of scarabs in with the map that you're running, and then that determines the league content, the juicing values, that sort of thing. Regardless of whatever system they come up with, I think map juicing in general just needs far more determinism and far less setup time. With towers out of the way, let's talk about maps. One of the big changes I'd like to see in maps moving forward is just the general reduction of clutter on maps. How many maps can you walk in a fucking straight line on? When you have Ravine and Slick, and that's pretty much it. Every other map, I feel like I'm an American picker in a fucking hoarder house. Oh, gotta step over the fucking pot. There's a rock right here. We have a bush. There's a couple of trees. This corner's just a little too fucking jagged. The fucking lamp is in the way. There is just so much shit in maps. I just want to fucking walk around. Okay, so I think in general, a reduction of clutter across the board is absolutely necessary. Of course, along with this, I think all of the layouts pretty much need to be redone. Maybe you could keep some of them, or at the very least, you need to be able to be somewhat selective of this. As a lot of people have already mentioned, it's either all the layouts have to be good if we're going to be forced to run every single one of them, or if you're going to have bad layouts, we need to kind of be able to pick which ones that we want. Another thing that I'd like to see changed in the future is the removal of the rare hunting system in maps to progress it. Honestly, I think they should just bring back map bosses in every map. I think the problem with map bosses in PoE 1 was that they were just boring as shit and you just killed them anyway. They were like a regular mob, but unique instead of rare or whatever the fuck. Whereas I think in PoE 2, map bosses are sick. I think they do some really cool things. I think the fights are actually pretty fun. And if we're going to make maps longer, I'm okay with bigger, more epic map bosses, that sort of thing. And maybe this is a bad change. I don't actually know, but it feels like it would be a lot better than at least the current system we have now. The last big major change I'd like to see for maps in PoE 2, at least for right now, is a homogenization of value across maps. One of the big issues is that when you're juicing maps and running league content, if you get your league content on something like Crypt, you're just automatically sad because it's Crypt and it's a fucking waste of time because it's a 2-second map that has no mobs on it. Whereas if you get it on something like, Slick or Savannah, you're like, fuck yeah, this is going to be a really good map to run. I'm super excited. I think that raising the value of the lower tier maps to be somewhat more equivalent with the higher tier maps would do a lot for the quality of life for mapping overall. Something else that I think really needs to be looked at is the atlas for PoE 2. In the future, I would really like to see an atlas that is much closer to the PoE 1 atlas tree. I think that is way more interesting and just way more fun to interact with. I understand that this is going to be somewhat limited because we just don't have a whole lot of league content. And of course, it was an early access and this was patched together and they had to throw something together that worked. So I have absolutely no worries about them, improving the atlas overall. But just in the general direction, I would like to see it. I would like to see more of the PoE 1 atlas. I think the PoE 1 atlas has a lot of fun options. I think it's far more interesting. I think you can do more with it. And I think just that general customization of the endgame adds a lot of value and flavor to it. Another major system that I think probably needs to be dealt with is for sure Rarity. I think Rarity is just one of those things that is too slippery of a slope to keep around. Rarity or Magic Find was also one of those things that we had around in PoE 1 that we ultimately ended up removing, and I think it was for good reason. In my opinion, Rarity causes far more problems than it solves. Firstly, it gatekeeps farming strategies for players, especially if they're in a trade league, because they just simply will not be able to keep up with the market if they're not farming with Rarity. So for example, if you are farming Breach and you like to farm Breach, but you have no Rarity on your character, well, it's more or less going to be a waste of time for you in a not very good strategy because there are players running it with 100, 200, 300% Rarity, and they are just going to obliterate the market with how much shit they're going to get out of it. And the only way you can really compete is if you have Rarity from the get-go. Another issue that comes from Rarity is that if Rarity is the premier farming strategy or the requirement to farm, and you are late to the market somehow, or it took you a minute to get to endgame or whatever, you are innately fucked on arrival because you need to have Rarity on your gear in order to participate in the market because everything is so inflated from all the drops. And the issue that comes from this is that in order to afford the gear with Rarity on it, you have to have a level level of currency that can only be attained by farming with Rarity. So it creates this incredibly negative cycle for which there is no entry point beyond an insane slog or just getting extremely lucky. The other issue that players will run into when they're trying to slot for Rarity is that you must have a surplus of character power in order to afford even putting Rarity on your gear. This creates a whole host of problems, especially for newer players or just normal players in general, because they're usually going to be struggling somewhat anyway. And if you're already struggling, the absolute last option that you can afford is a reduction in character power in order to get Rarity on gear. But the problem is you need to get that Rarity in order to farm more effectively so you can afford better gear to solve your character's power problems. Not only are all these issues highly toxic for normal players, Rarity also introduces another layer consideration for meta. Now, not only do we have to look at a character's speed, clear, survivability, single target, that sort of thing, we also have to consider how well the build can tolerate a reduction in character power in favor of slotting Rarity. This introduces an even further consideration of meta when it comes to picking your build, because now not only do you want to have a character that has good speed, good clear, that sort of thing, you also want to pick a character that doesn't waste your fucking time in the endgame. I mean, as you can see here, I'm playing this zoomer fucking idiot because as much as I want to play my Warbringer, who is dope as fuck, he's absolutely slow as shit, and I can't afford to put Rarity on that motherfucker. So if I want to farm endgame in a way that respects my time, I have to pick a build that can tolerate Rarity as a function of power loss that ideally is as fast as possible, and then you end up with either a fucking LA Deadeye or this stat stacking dog shit. Again, to reiterate, I just think a lot of these problems are completely unnecessary, and I understand the need for SSF players to have some sort of way to get better drops and improve the amount of currency they're getting, but I think we already solved this problem once again in PoE 1, where the primary way of juicing Rarity and quantity was through map modifiers and map modifier effect. The more map modifiers you had on a map and the more difficult the map was, the more quantity and rarity you had in the map area, and you could further leverage this with your Atlas tree by improving map modifier effect. I think the system makes a ton of sense. It can be linear if you want it to be. You have total deterministic control over it. Somewhat, I mean, there's some re-rolling to go on, that's true. But overall, I just think it was a better system in general. And this is where I would like to see the Future of PoE 2 go, because I think this is just a way better solution for Rarity across the board, and who gives a fuck about Waystone drop chance? Moving on, another area I would like to look at is the builds and classes in general, and one of the things I would really like to see here is just a homogeneity of vision, and I think this is really abundant or clear when you look at something like the Ranger versus the Warrior, where the Warrior is kind of designed to be this slow, bumbling fucking idiot through both his passive tree and his ascendancies, whereas when we look at something like Ranger, they're almost meant to be like some zoomer fuck. And I don't think you can have both of these things in the same game. One of them is very reminiscent to PoE 1 missing a Quicksilver flask pretty much is the only difference, and then the other one is very clearly meant to exist in an entirely different ecosystem and an entirely different game. Obviously, I think this is actually an extremely difficult task to do, which is why it doesn't surprise me at all that we encountered something like this in early access, but I do think, moving forward in the future of the game, it is definitely something that needs to be addressed. Something else I'd really like to see in the future moving forward is more combos on characters. I think this was something that actually surprised me with how much it broke down in early access, but I feel like a lot of the characters and builds became very one-buttony, almost more so one-buttony than a lot of the builds that you see in PoE 1. The last major thing that I'd really like to see in terms of builds and classes in PoE 2 is a larger coverage of archetypes and more identity within ascendancies. For example, I would like to see, an ascendancy that is very obviously like a Crusader or a Paladin, or an ascendancy that's very clearly oriented around daggers and a rogue style type of character, and I think that that was something that PoE 1 ultimately missed out on. While obviously the fluidity of class design and the lack of walls and barriers across character creation and customization was without a doubt one of the greatest design choices of PoE 1, I think that it came with an unfortunate drawback that a lot of the ascendancies didn't really feel special. They kind of just served different purposes, and they became not so much niche special things, but rather just different flavors of the same thing. So, okay, do we want to run the Trickster defensive shell because that's really useful here, or we could run this melee skill on the Berserker offensive layer, or we could take the Jug defensive layer, right? They were kind of just just different ways of solving major problems rather than these really specific, niche, cool, unique things like the demon form on Witch, which is sick as fuck. And when you see it, it makes you want to play a witch. You know it's a witch. It's really cool. It's very specific to that ascendancy. Whereas in PoE 1, all we're doing is just exchanging a layer for something else. Like, you know, you can have a Bone Shadow character. You don't necessarily know if it's a Jug, a Berserker, or a Slayer out the gate by watching it. Again, obviously you can tell in certain ways, but for the most part, from its gameplay style, you wouldn't really be able to tell. And while this was absolutely a positive thing in PoE 1, I think it would be cool to move the other direction in PoE 2, which I do think they're already doing. The last thing I'll make a mention of for this video is crafting. I won't say too much here because I think it's pretty apparent to everyone that crafting is super dog shit. I don't even want to call it crafting. It's pretty much just gambling. But the devs have admitted that this is a problem. They've already talked about how they're going to make it more deterministic, but that they don't want the same determinism that they have in PoE 1. Up until recently, I would have actually agreed with this sentiment, and I would have thought that, yeah, you don't want to have the same level of determinism in PoE 1 because it leads to a lot of power creep or whatever, but I just don't know how true that is anymore. Especially when we look at the gear and items that we have now, the Mirror Tier crafters figured it out. I mean, regardless of how deterministic or non-deterministic it is, the endgame players will always just create super OP broke shit no matter what, it seems like. And if it's any more deterministic now, it's only going to get worse. And originally I had thought that if crafting was less deterministic, you would have a mitigation of power creep, but that is obviously not the case. And what it seems to be more so is that whether crafting is hyper deterministic or not, all it changes is the divine value that the high-end players have to spend. If it's more deterministic, instead of spending 8,000 divine to make the mirror tier item, they have to spend 3,000. But whatever the cost based off the deterministic probability of crafting at the time is, mirror tier crafters are just going to pay it. And it seems that the only effect that we get from making crafting more random and less deterministic is that it does nothing to prevent gear from becoming insane, but rather it makes it so that normal players have a much more difficult time creating gear that is viable and useful. The last thing I'll point out with crafting too is that from the PoE 1 system, crafting had a really legitimate form of skill expression, which I thought was cool. It was dope to see your time rewarded to be able to create better and more effective items more efficiently and cheaper, and I think that that is something that I probably want to see in PoE 2 as well. I think people should be rewarded for their time and knowledge, and crafting is most certainly one of the methods of doing that. Little Right team, that is all she wrote for me. It was absolutely lovely to talk to you guys once again, and I will see you in the next one. Deuces.